Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for this opportunity to update you on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. This discussion is particularly urgent as the conflict and its catastrophic impacts grind on into another winter. Daily attacks continue, inflicting death, injury, and untold suffering on ordinary Ukrainians, and destruction and damage to civilian infrastructure. Near the front line, people live life on the edge. They face constant shelling and impossible choices, flee in perilous conditions, leaving everything they have, perhaps for the second or third time, or stay and risk injury or death. This is no idle concern. Dozens of civilians have been killed in recent attacks in the regions of Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, Kyiv, Kherson, joining the thousands whose lives have already been claimed by this brutal war. And as the use of long-range weapons has steadily increased since July, so has the civilian toll. November saw a particularly deadly increase. Last month, long-range weapons killed 65 civilians and injured 372 across 11 regions of Ukraine, double the number of October. Madam President, as temperatures start to drop as low as minus 20 degrees Celsius in some places, our concerns for civilians intensifies, particularly in light of widespread damage to critical infrastructure. Since March this year, Russian armed forces have conducted repeated, large-scale coordinated attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. According to UNDP, more than 60% of energy generation facilities have now been damaged. Going into the coldest months of the year, civilians' access to electricity, gas, heating, and water have been severely affected. These impacts are exacerbated by a simultaneous and equally egregious increase in attacks harming humanitarian operations. Humanitarian offices, vehicles, storage facilities, and relief supplies have all been damaged, and humanitarian workers have not been spared. This year, the number of humanitarian aid workers killed in Ukraine has almost tripled, from 4 in 2022 and 5 in 2023 to 11 so far in 2024. Madam President, across Ukraine, some 14.6 million people currently need humanitarian assistance. 10 million people have now been displaced. Of these, 3.5 million people are being hosted in communities across every one of Ukraine's 24 regions, and around 6.5 million are refugees in other countries. This displacement is having a disproportionately negative impact on women and girls, particularly older women. Their exposure to gender-based violence has been heightened, and their access to support services hindered.
Madam President, we see today's meeting as a desperate attempt by the sponsors and the puppeteers of the Kyiv regime to keep Ukraine afloat as a topic in the Security Council. And this under conditions when a large part of the international community is objectively losing interest in this topic. This comes as no surprise because of late, the Ukrainian President Zelensky, past his expiration date, managed to discredit the Kyiv authorities to such an extent that it's only Ukraine's accomplices who dare to express support for it, those who inspired and supported the anti-constitutional coup d'etat in February of 2014. We all had an opportunity to see the former comedian going to great pains to kowtow before the Republicans who won the US election. He's been trying to shift the focus from the fact that Kyiv had bet on the Democrats. Zelensky and his team have been traveling across the US and its satellites, hands outstretched, trying to secure the understanding that the new administration will not throw them under the bus. The sour expressions on the faces of Kyiv officials can be explained not by the fact that they haven't managed to get a new license to rule, nor are they explained by the fact that they're receiving signals about an inevitable increase in military support. They are explained by the fact that there might be an audit conducted of the US money that's already been spent on Ukraine. This is the most frightening scenario for the Ukrainian authorities, mired in corruption. We've warned about this many times. This was recently reconfirmed by the new appointee for the incoming administration, the head of the FBI, Kash Patel. He said that I would ask Congress to investigate where this money went. The American people should get an answer to this. How can we trust this government when we give such large sums and do not receive reports on what they're spent on? End of quote. Mr. Kash Patel also intends to figure out whether the Ukrainian president used false security threats to get financial assistance from the US. It's worth noting that the Western media and the few independent media left in Ukraine are united in their assessment of the fact that this audit only spells trouble for the Ukrainian leadership and for their democratic accomplices. It's no surprise, it comes as no surprise that they are now engaged in a frenzy of activity. The National Security Advisor of President Biden, Jake Sullivan, was blunt. He said that the outgoing administration is going to do everything to give Ukraine every instrument to continue strengthening its position on the battlefield. He clarified that he is referring to en masse supplies of military equipment to spend every dollar which Congress has allocated by the time Biden leaves office, end of quote. Let me remind you that he's referring to a drawdown of $6.5 billion. However, as Western experts have pointed out, we're not referring to actual supplies of weapons to the Kyiv regimes. It's practically impossible to do this in such a short period of time. What they're referring to is about how they're going to split the pie, how they're going to get kickbacks, which the incoming Trump administration down on. We advise everybody to get their popcorn ready. There's going to be a lot of fuss in the coming months. The supplies of Western weapons and Western support to keep the Kyiv posse afloat is something we're going to discuss at a separate meeting, which we've requested for the 20th of December. Colleagues, according to a recent Gallup poll, Ukrainians are in favor of ending the conflict as soon as possible and are ready to accept inevitable territorial. We know how biased Western sociologists are, which means we have every reason to believe that the real figure is much higher. The real sentiments in Ukrainian society can be seen in the fact that over 100,000 people have deserted, and Ukrainians on the whole are unwilling to fight for this inhumane, corrupt regime which has usurped power in Ukraine in violation of the constitution. It is also confirmed by the fact that Ukrainians have been fleeing the free-for-all unleashed by the Ukrainian authorities, moving to Russia en masse, returning to ex-Ukrainian territories which are now part of Russia. Having picked up on these sentiments and receiving signals from Washington which are not reassuring, the heads of the Kyiv junta have of late lowered expectations. They, and specifically the president, are not waxing lyrical as much about the peace plan. They're talking about ideas about how we can settle the crisis. This showy peace-loving should do nothing to fool us. They are united in the fact there is a common denominator. All of these ideas are a rehash of the Zelensky formula. Also, they are impossible to implement in practice, as they do not address the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. In fact, this, just like the ideas of the turncoat Western politicians, all of this boils down to freezing the conflict along the contact line, giving up the territories which are now part of Russia, as well as security guarantees. The latest thing on the wish list of the Ukrainian president is to get from Joe Biden, before he leaves the White House, an invitation from NATO for Ukraine's territory within its internationally recognized borders, and to ensure that NATO's guarantees would extend to that part of Ukraine which the country currently controls, with potential for future expansion, end of quote. Even if we cast aside this very rich idea, we'd like to remind you that no freezing of the conflict with the Russian Federation is agreeable to us. We saw for ourselves with the Minsk agreements that we cannot trust neither the Kyiv junta nor the West. We understand full well that the whole point of this exercise is to give the regime in Kyiv a breather on the battlefield so that they can lick their wounds and rearm. There can be no discussion about NATO having a role in settling the Ukrainian crisis. NATO and the prospects of membership therein have been part of the problem since the very beginning, not part of the solution. If we analyze this new mindset, which the president has recently espoused, we call everyone to look at what's happening, not at what people are saying. And here everything is clear. Through its actions, the Kyiv regime is continuing to opt for confrontation and raising the stakes. This is confirmed by the ongoing strikes using Western high-precision weapons, including the strikes on the 11th and 13th of December on military objects in Taganrog and Orel, using long-range Western missiles. Let me remind you that in an interview to Time magazine, Donald Trump said that these actions were stupid and a serious escalation. He said, and I quote, "I disagree very vehemently with sending missiles hundreds of miles into Russia. Why are we doing that? We're just escalating this war and making it worse." End of quote. We hope that these words uttered by the incoming president will be commented on by our US colleagues today. The Ukrainian leadership, past its expiration date, does not want to resolve the situation, and in fact they've repudiated Hungary's proposal to introduce a Christmas ceasefire and an exchange of prisoners. On our side, we drew up a list of prisoners, but the Zelensky regime once again rudely, categorically rejected to take over 600 Ukrainian servicemen back. They've been in Russia for over a year. It's an open secret that ordinary Ukrainians who ended up on the front owing to the forcible mobilization are of no concern to the Kyiv regime. They only want to trade militias from nationalist battalions as well as foreign mercenaries, which took part in military hostilities against Russia. The last thing I want to say about these pseudo-peace initiatives from the president, I'd like to remind everyone that the decree dated October 2022 banning negotiations with the Russian leadership has to date not been revoked. So draw your own conclusions as to whether Ukraine's statements and calls are genuine. We don't rule out the fact that they are possibly a smokescreen for yet another escalation, as was the case in July and August of this year, just before the Ukrainians entered the Kursk Oblast. Madam President, we'd like to use this opportunity to draw members' attention to an incident that occurred with an IAEA Secretariat vehicle on the 10th of December. This occurred during a planned rotation of IAEA experts at the ZNPP. There were strikes on a vehicle that was transporting IAEA staff. The Russian motorcade was going back after it drove experts to the contact line, and it was also attacked. Thankfully, there were no victims. During rotations, and this is in fact the 25th rotation, the Russian Federation takes upon itself to ensure a truce and provides security guarantees to all staff. The Ukrainians have violated these obligations on a number of occasions, including in June and November of last year and in April of this year. According to IAEA Information Circular 264, the incident occurred when staff were driving across territory controlled by Ukraine to an area where they were supposed to cross the contact line. The driver saw an uncrewed aerial vehicle approaching from behind, so from the north where Ukrainian formations are stationed. Let me clarify that this occurred in the run-up to an emergency session of the Board of Governors of the IAEA called by Ukraine. We unequivocally condemn this provocation on the part of the Kyiv regime, which put at risk the lives of IAEA staff and Russian servicemen, which were ensuring the rotation run smoothly. We call on international organizations and the international community to condemn yet another instance of Ukraine flagrantly violating international humanitarian law. Madam President, I must also comment, by way of conclusion, an incident on the 10th of December 2024 when the Solomensk court of the city of Kyiv issued a sentence vis-à-vis a Ukrainian human rights defender, Ms. Elena Berezhnaya. She's well known the world over. A 70-year-old human rights defender, an anti-fascist activist, she was sentenced to 14 years behind bars and the confiscation of her property. Prior to this, she was in detention for over 2.5 years, and in fact, in pretrial detention, she was tortured. Let me remind you, the Zelensky regime filed proceedings immediately after Elena spoke at an informal RAM meeting, UN Security Council meeting called by the Russian Federation on the 22nd of December 2021. The basis for the sentence that was handed down was a letter Ms. Berezhnyia sent to the UN, which I quoted on the 28th of March 2022 at a General Assembly meeting. In other words, the Kyiv regime is, before our very eyes, cracking down on this human rights defender because she spoke at our invitation here at the UN and also penned a letter to our organization criticizing the human rights situation in Ukraine. I'm interested to see whether today some of our Western colleagues, those who under different circumstances show such deep concern about the safety of briefers who've been invited by the UN, whether they'll exhibit an iota of conscience and courage to give an honest assessment of these actions on the part of Zelensky and his posse. Colleagues, we hope that those among you who really do seek peace in Ukraine, after my statement today, will have no illusions left about what Zelensky is really trying to achieve, what his posse is trying to achieve, and that you will see how far they are from bringing peace to Ukraine. Zelensky and his posse are prepared to sacrifice all of their citizens, to mobilize women and children just to hold on to power and to evade punishment for the crimes they've committed against their people. But the end of the criminal and rapacious regime is near. The front line is coming undone across the board. The territory under Ukraine's control is shrinking by the day. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are more actively seeking peace and refusing to go and fight. Our conditions for ending the conflict are clear and logical. They have nothing to do with those surrogate formulas, which do nothing to address the threat that Kyiv poses for Russia. Formulas which of late have been very actively promoted by Kyiv's Western allies. While they do this promotion work, we will continue to pursue the objectives of our special military operations by military means and respond to Kyiv's provocations just like we did on the 13th of December. I thank you.
President, I thank Director Dalton for her briefing. As the crisis in Ukraine drags on, ordinary people have suffered immensely. In conflict areas, many large-scale infrastructures have been damaged. Food, daily necessities, and other daily necessities are severely lacking. And basic public services such as water, electricity, and heating are difficult to guarantee. According to the statistics from OCHA, as a result of the war, more than 14.6 million people in Ukraine are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, and 3.5 million have been displaced. Less than half of the 2024 humanitarian appeal for Ukraine has been fulfilled. As another winter approaches, people are struggling to survive the war and the severe cold, and the humanitarian situation is very worrying. China once again calls on the parties to the conflict to exercise calm and restraint, strictly observe international humanitarian law, and refrain from attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call on the international community and humanitarian organizations to set up their humanitarian assistance based on the principle of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, so as to ensure the base displaced persons and that the people in conflict zones can live in peace and warmth during the winter. Recently, the IAEA safety and security team stationed at the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant was attacked by a drone during rotation, to which China expresses serious concern. We appreciate Director General Grossi's 7 pillars on the safety and security of nuclear facilities and the 5 principles for the safety of the ZNPP, and urge all parties not to take actions that endanger the safety of nuclear facilities and IAEA staff. President, there is no winner in conflict and war, and military means cannot bring lasting peace. An early ceasefire and a political solution are in the best interest of all parties and is the only feasible way to resolve the crisis. In view of the recent intensification of the war on the ground, I would like to reiterate China's adherence to the three principles of no spillover from the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no incitement of conflict. Currently, the international community's discussions surrounding the crisis in Ukraine are increasingly focusing on negotiations and moving closer to peace. Some peace ideas and plans have surfaced in the media, and recently both parties to conflict have released political signals towards negotiations. We call on both sides to meet each other halfway and start peace talks at an early date. We call on the international community to provide support and create a favorable condition to form synergy in promoting peace and negotiations, as well as de-escalation. China's position on the Ukrainian issue has been consistent, which is to promote peace, negotiations, and political settlement. We insist on working for peace and promoting talks. We always maintain that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed, and the legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously. All efforts that are conducive to the peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported. We have actively engaged in shuttle diplomacy, initiating the establishment of Friends for Peace group on the Ukraine crisis in the UN. With countries of the global south, such as Brazil, we have only one goal in mind: to mobilize voices for peace, promote consensus for peace, and support efforts for peace. We hope that the dawn of peace will arrive soon, and that the people who have suffered so much from the war will soon return to a life of peace and tranquility. China will continue to make unremitting efforts together with the international community, including the global south, to achieve a political settlement of the crisis in Ukraine. I thank you.
President, it is a tragedy and an outrage that once again we are having to address the appalling impacts of Russia's illegal invasion. I'd like to make 3 points. First, the humanitarian cost of Russia's barbaric war has been immense. This year, 14.6 million people, 40% of Ukraine's population, required humanitarian assistance. At least 10,000 civilians have been killed and over 18,500 injured. 6 million Ukrainian refugees are registered across Europe. 3.6 million people are internally displaced in Ukraine. This winter, following a total of 12 major strikes on their energy system in 2024, Ukrainians face limited access to power, water, and heating. The most recent of these came last Friday. Over the course of these attacks, all 3 of Ukraine's operating nuclear power plants have been forced to reduce generation, and millions have been left without power. The targeting of substations providing electricity to nuclear plants directly threatens the safety of Ukraine and the wider region. In this regard, we welcome the resolution adopted by the IAEA's Board of Governors last week. Russia's suggestion to the IAEA is that the solution to the threat that Russia itself is causing is to put the affected power stations into cold shutdown. This cynically ignores the further humanitarian impact this would have on the civilian population. The solution is simpler. Russia should cease these reckless attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure and adhere to the IAEA DG's 7 pillars for nuclear safety and security.
Since the day Russia started its aggression against Ukraine, in a blatant violation of the UN Charter, lives have been upended, cities shattered, and the very principle of sovereignty and peace systematically trampled upon. Russia's unprovoked aggression continues to devastate critical civilian infrastructure, particularly Ukraine's energy systems. Last Friday, in a brutal continuation of the massive strikes on November 17th as well as November 27th to 28th, Russia unleashed hundreds of missiles and drones on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. These merciless attacks have caused widespread power outages, leaving millions without electricity or heating, and severely damaged key power plants and substations. We are appalled by the scale of devastation and strongly condemn these attacks by Russia. Such attacks further exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in harsh winter. Alarmingly, this situation has entered a dangerous phase with the deployment of DPRK troops to Russia, now engaged in a combat against Ukraine. We are deeply alarmed by the deepening cooperation between the two. We condemn in the strongest possible terms this unlawful, unjustified, and unacceptable military cooperation, ignoring all the relevant Security Council resolutions. Madam President, the deliberate targeting of energy infrastructure is deplorable and has far-reaching consequences. Beyond energy systems, the ripple effects have impacted other facilities, including medical centers, straining already overstretched emergency services and placing first responders in grave danger from secondary strikes while they carry out life-saving missions. In this context, my delegation is deeply troubled by Russia's clear and persistent disregards of international law, particularly international humanitarian law, targeting civilians.
Thank you, Lisa Doughton, for your briefing. In December, the weather in Ukraine hovers below freezing. It's not uncommon for the temperature to drop at night to 4 below Fahrenheit. That's 20 below Celsius. Just 3 years ago, before the country was consumed by Russia's brutal, senseless war, Ukrainians could avoid the snow and the wind and the damp. But now, as Russia continues to attack Ukraine's energy grid, the cold is inescapable. Yet, paradoxically, today, instead of addressing this issue, Russia's PR uses his time to attempt to interpret what he believes to be the policies of the next administration, something that is not in his purview, particularly when he can't explain Russia's own policy of aggression against Ukraine. Since March 2024, Russia has destroyed around half of Ukraine's power generation capacity, leading to rolling blackouts that affect every Ukrainian across the country. Some 3.5 million of those people are living without power at all. For those whose windows and roofs have been lost to Russian strikes, there is little they can do to keep out the frigid air. These attacks, including drone strikes and now cluster munitions, have only increased in frequency these past few months. Just days ago, Russia launched one of the largest area assaults yet, using drones and missiles to target Ukraine's energy grid and other critical infrastructure. In just one day, Russia took out 2 gigawatts of power availability. That's enough power for over 1.5 million homes. Ukraine's energy workers are working heroically to keep their countrymen warm. But despite their efforts and despite assistance from the United States and other international partners, the power generation deficit Russia has created in Ukraine will likely persist long into the next year, leaving Ukrainian households with power outages of up to 20 hours per day. And then there is the potential risk of nuclear disaster posed by Russia's reckless seizure and occupation of Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant. Of course, we know the weaponization of energy is just one facet of Putin's war of conquest. Over the past 3 years, Russia has killed more than 12,000 civilians, nearly 28,000 more have been injured, and millions have been displaced in attacks on schools and shops, homes and hospitals. Still others have been forcibly transported into Russia, children, stolen from everything they've ever known, many still missing to this day. As discussed earlier this month, these atrocities were orchestrated and overseen by the highest levels of the Russian government, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, unleashed in systematic violation of Russia's obligations under international law to protect civilian life and civilian infrastructure. And Russia is not acting alone. It relies on Iran for drones and other weapons, launching record numbers of Iranian Shahed attack UAVs at Ukraine's power grid. It relies on the DPRK for missiles, ammunition, and soldiers, positioning North Koreans on Russia's front lines under the command of the Russian military. And it relies on China to maintain its war industrial base, supplying it with machine tools, microelectronics, and other weapons components, and to give it political cover, including right here in this council. Thanks to Russia and its enablers, Ukraine is experiencing a humanitarian crisis, but this humanitarian crisis is not limited to Ukraine. Russia's assault on agriculture has threatened food security for tens of millions of the world's most vulnerable, especially in the Sahel. This destruction is compounded by Russia's attacks on merchant ships in the Black Sea and surrounding seaports, which have killed and injured dozens of people and only further impeded delivery of much-needed grain. Innocent Ukrainians, innocent people all across the world are paying the price for this war of conquest. They didn't ask for this war, and they cannot stop it. The one who can is Putin. Putin can at any time end the conflict that has not only killed Ukrainians, but hundreds of thousands of Russians too. Soldiers who could have been home with their families, but instead were tossed into a senseless conflict. It goes without saying, Russia must withdraw its forces from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. And Russia must pay for the damage it has caused in Ukraine through its violations of international law, including international humanitarian law and the UN Charter. Colleagues, I'm not naive. Years of these demands have yet to change Putin's behavior. This is someone who pays no heed to the legal obligations to which his country is bound. This is someone who doesn't care about the human cost of this war, who doesn't care about people freezing or hungry, who doesn't care about the hundreds of thousands of casualties his own people have suffered. And this is someone who has escaped accountability, whose imperial ambition continue despite his abject failure to conquer Ukraine or overthrow its democratically elected government. But I know that while justice in this case may be deferred, it will not be denied. Nations worldwide that value the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, that value justice, that value human lives, stand with Ukraine for a just and lasting peace. And when, not if, but when, Ukraine achieves that just and lasting peace, Russia will need to answer for its unlawful actions. Colleagues, winter has arrived in Ukraine. Its people are bracing for the dark, cold months ahead. But let us be inspired by their resolve, by their willingness to defend their homes, their freedoms, their very identities, even in the most dire of circumstances, and maintain our resolve too. Let us continue to demand Russia end the killing and end the war, and let us stop at nothing to ensure accountability of those who wage it. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I give them the floor.
President, you just spoke as the representative of the United States. I would like to briefly respond to that statement. The U.S. has accused China, and this is not in line with the facts. We cannot accept that. The fact is this. The supplier of weapons to the battlefield, trying to prolong the conflict, is the United States itself, not China. China is not a party to the creation of the Ukraine crisis. It's not a party to the conflict itself. Since the outbreak of the conflict, what we have been doing is to call for peace, work for peace, to promote peace talks. I would like to urge the United States to work together with China and the broader international community to end the war as soon as possible in order of the conflict. President, before I conclude, I would like to remind you, respectively, as the U.S. representative, you need to pay attention to the fact that on the Ukrainian issue, the situation has evolved. The U.S. statement should also be updated in line with the changing situation. Thank you very much.
I shall make a further statement in my capacity as representative of the United States. I appreciate China's response to our statement, but our statement was not accusation, it was fact, that China is providing sustenance and support for Russia's efforts in Ukraine. What we all want to see in Ukraine is peace, and that peace is about Putin pulling his troops out of Ukraine. Thank you very much. I resume my function as president of the Council, and I presume that the representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement, so I give him the floor.
Thank you, President. I shall be very brief. We have not provided any lethal weapons to any party to the conflict. With regards to the dual-use items, we have exercised strict control. Along with the international community, we are working towards the peace. And this is what we've been doing, and we hope the U.S. will do the same. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the, I'm sorry, I lost my way, to the representative of, of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Director Dutton, I also recognize here the residual presence of the Russian delegation in the Soviet seat. As the capo regime who keeps selling you popcorn, today, in a very perverse way, is trying to take on the mantle of the future FBI spokesperson. No doubt that the founder of the FBI, known as Charlie the Crook Chaser, is getting all shook up in his grave, ready to chase the Putin's envoy. We are grateful to France and Ecuador for initiating this meeting to highlight the dire humanitarian consequences of the Russian invasion for the people of Ukraine. The onset of the cold winter season has again exposed the fact that Russia's practice against Ukraine's civilian population amount to acts of genocide. By targeting critical energy infrastructure in an attempt to deprive Ukrainians of electricity, heat, and running water, Russia deliberately inflicts on them living conditions calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. Such acts fall under one of the definitions of genocide as per 1948 Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Last Friday, December the 13th, Ukraine faced one of the largest attacks yet against its energy system. 94 missiles and 193 drones targeted critical energy facilities across the country. It's worth noting that our air defense systems, including F-16 fighter jets, successfully intercepted 84 of these missiles. We reiterate our profound gratitude to all allies who continue to bolster Ukraine's defense capabilities. Their contributions are not only acts of solidarity, but also critical measures in the prevention of genocide, a noble and principled commitment that will be forever held in esteem by history. It is alarming that Russia again targeted facilities crucial for the stable operation of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. 5 out of 9 operating reactors had to reduce power following Friday's attack. It speaks volumes that this happened less than 24 hours after the IAEA Board of Governors adopted its resolution on implications of unstable energy infrastructure critical to safety and security of nuclear power plant. Ukraine is grateful to all states that voted for this document. It is clear, however, that when dealing with Moscow, the strengths of diplomacy must be backed by the strengths of weapons and sanctions. Moreover, as Russia attacks not only Ukrainian energy facilities but also IAEA convoys, as did on December the 10th on a road in the Zaporizhzhia region. Madam President, last Friday's strike was the 12th carried out by Russia against our energy infrastructure in 2024 alone. For these strikes, Russia used about 1,100 missiles, both cruise and ballistic ones. I reiterate, this is the number of missiles launched against energy facilities only. Russia continues to use munitions containing toxic chemicals, and we have documented 4,950 cases since February 2023. More than 2,000 Ukrainian servicemen suffered from chemical poisoning. Today, the Security Service of Ukraine issued a notice of charges against Russian Lieutenant General Kirillov, who ordered the use of chemical weapons against Ukraine servicemen. A lot of other deadly weapons remain in Russian stockpiles, mostly from the Soviet times. Guided aerial bombs are among the deadliest. In just 1 week, Russia launched almost 500 guided aerial bombs on Ukrainian positions as well as residential areas of Ukrainian cities. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in September-November alone, Russia's guided aerial bombs killed 108 civilians and injured 755 in Ukraine, representing 25% of all civilian casualties in the period. Modifications of these weapons have extended their range, exposing cities at a distance of several dozen kilometers from the front line to unprecedented threats. Last week, the city of Zaporizhzhia sustained 2 terrorist attacks by Russia. On December the 6th, a guided aerial bomb killed 11 local residents. 8 victims burned to death in their cars following the explosion, including 14-year-old Tanya and 11-year-old Katya. 24 civilians were injured, among them 3 children. In 4 days, on December the 10th, Russia again attacked Zaporizhzhia, this time with Iskander ballistic missile, hitting a private medical facility and nearby buildings. 11 people were killed, including 4 medical workers, and 22 were injured. The Kremlin also deliberately targets humanitarian personnel. Since February 2022, Russian forces have killed at least 99 Ukrainian rescuers and injured about 400 others. The deliberate targeting of civilians, children, and first responders is a war crime, which underscores the need for the international community to hold Russia accountable and to intensify efforts to protect Ukraine's most vulnerable populations. Humanitarian support is vital for Ukraine. We commend the work of the UN humanitarian team in Ukraine and express our gratitude to OCHA, UNHCR, IOM, UNICEF, UNDP, UNEP, UNFPA, and other UN agencies for their active engagement in addressing the ongoing humanitarian crisis. We also deeply appreciate the support provided by our global partners and donors. We call upon them, along with UN agencies and stakeholders, to keep Ukraine at the center of the global humanitarian agenda alongside other affected regions. Madam President, as long as Russia's war of aggression against my country lasts, the ordinary people will bear the heaviest burden. That is why achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter remains a key priority for Ukraine, and I believe the entire civilized world. This vision stands in stark contrast to what Russia demands under the guise of peace proposals. It is a demand to capitulate and voluntarily surrender our sovereignty, and this will never happen. Does anybody believe that Russia is interested in genuine peace while claiming the territories it has occupied and even those it has failed to occupy. It is just testing the strength of the democratic world's resilience, or rather its weakness. And if such weakness is demonstrated in the case of Ukraine, the world should be ready for new waves of Russian aggression sooner rather than later. Moscow will restore its offensive capabilities and learn from its mistakes. And then it will attack again, especially if Ukraine can no longer serve as a shield standing in the way of Russian aggression. The pace of Russia's rebuilding its war machine will depend on how effectively the sanctions are preserved and enforced, or how many loopholes allow Moscow to bypass current restrictions. Fossil fuel exports are a key source of funding for aggressive regimes. In 2023 alone, Russia earned $188 billion from oil exports. Recently, our intelligence released a dossier on 238 participants in a shadow fleet of aging oil tankers. The shadow fleet consists of over 1,000 aging, poorly maintained vessels with convoluted ownership structures. With a combined dead weight of over 100 million tons, roughly 17% of the global oil tanker fleet, it represents a global challenge that literally fuels the Russian war. This shadow fleet is also a real ecological time bomb that could go off at any moment. This was demonstrated yesterday in the Kerch Strait, where 2 Russian tankers were crashed, with one of them simply splitting in half. This disaster caused an oil spill reportedly amounted to 4,000 tons of oil products. Given the poor technical condition of the Russian shadow fleet, the recurrence of such a disaster is only a matter of time if decisive action is not taken to deprive Russia of such a tool. Madam President, as we are approaching the 3rd anniversary of the 3-day military operation, it is obvious that Putin cannot defeat Ukraine militarily. Now he and his generals throw all available reserves onto the battleground in an attempt to grab more lands regardless of the losses. In October and November, Russian losses reach unprecedented levels, exceeding 40,000 soldiers per month. Remarkably, as follows from the Russian statements, these soldiers are dying in Ukraine's Donbass region in a war against the United States, not against Ukraine. Moreover, Russia claims it has been attacked by the United States. You may consider it to be nonsense, and you will be right, but such nonsense circulated most recently by Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov on the sidelines of the OSCE ministerial meeting in Malta, and serves as a calculated purpose. By publicly labeling Ukraine's allies as Russia's primary enemies, the Kremlin sends a message of intimidation. We could do to you what we are doing to Ukraine. Genocidal destruction of energy infrastructure, medium-range ballistic missile strikes. These are the tools to intimidate the free world and discourage it from supporting Ukraine. However, these threats reveal that Putin himself is driven by fear. In truth, he dreads engaging directly with Ukraine's allies. This fear will persist as long as our allies demonstrate unwavering resolve in supporting us, particularly by enabling Ukraine to dismantle Russia's aggressive capabilities, in particular on Russian territory. The only factor that may alleviate his fears is our own weakness and readiness to capitulate, and this will never happen. Putin's envoy may issue threats to this council and indulge in the delusion of representing a superpower. However, the reality is starkly different. Russia's overextended neo-imperial ambitions are steadily unraveling. The Kremlin's intervention in Syria has culminated in failure, and the collapse of its ventures in Africa will follow. Putin's small victorious war against Ukraine will meet the same ignominious end. He knows this, just as he knows that his portraits will soon be reduced to rags, not only in Syria, but in Russia itself. The world must not succumb to the Kremlin's bluff. Peace can and will be secured through strength, for strength remains the only language that an aggressor comprehends. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. Russia remains in blatant violation of the UN Charter, disregarding multiple UN General Assembly resolutions, including principles of UN Charter underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, which was adopted in February 2023 with a majority of 141 votes. Russia also violates the order of the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend all military operations in Ukraine. The suffering that Russia continues to inflict on Ukrainian civilians is intolerable. Contrary to its claims, Russia is systematically attacking the civilian population, often targeting rescue and humanitarian workers.